Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Scott Samuelson and I'm a professor of philosophy at Kirkwood Community College on the Iowa City campus. Wow, this election has been something else. A little over a year ago, I remember reading a few articles on how this presidential election was going to be boring, almost surely another Bush versus another Clinton. The election has been anything but boring. Jeb Bush's campaign, despite his immense fundraising, barely got off the ground. And Donald Trump, someone with no political experience at all, is now the Republican nominee. Yes, frontrunner Hillary Clinton won the Democratic nomination, but only after a long, hard-fought primary season against an erstwhile socialist and independent, Bernie Sanders. It's been a year of outsiders, animosity against elites, and political realignments. No matter who gets elected, there are huge questions about where we as a country go from here. What have we learned in this campaign about how we treat each other and how we ought to treat each other? What are the moral lessons of the political outsiders and this political season more generally? How should we move forward as a country? We have a great panel on this morning to discuss these questions. To my left is Todd Dorman, a columnist at the Gazette. Thanks for being on, Todd. Lyle Muller, the executive director at Iowa Center for Public Affairs Journalism, Iowa Watch. Thanks for being on, Lyle.
Glad to be here.
And at the end, Peter Jauhiainen, a professor of religion at Kirkwood Community College on the Cedar Rapids campus. Peter, thanks for being on. Well, Todd, maybe we can start with you. What has caused the rise of the political outsiders in this election? Have the Democrats and the Republicans failed to respond to a significant portion of our citizenry?
Well, I mean, the voters I talk to, you get a sense, I mean, both among Democrats and Republicans, that there's a lot of anxiety about a lot of issues, especially economic issues. I think Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side tapped into this idea that there's this sort of rigged economic system that is, controlled by, as you mentioned, the elites, and it runs against the sort of the hopes and aspirations of working people. Donald Trump has also sort of tapped into a little bit of that, as sort of saying he's going to be the voice of working people and people who have been forgotten, the silent majority, to sort of, go back and pull a phrase from Richard Nixon's era. So yeah, I think there's a lot of folks who feel like the power structure in Washington is no longer responsive to the needs and problems that they face in their everyday lives. And so you've seen people who are outside of that power structure sort of rise during this election. Of course, Hillary Clinton, part of her problem is that she is very, much connected to that power structure, and that's one of the perceptions she's had to fight.
Right. Well, Lyle, let's bring you in on this too. I mean, is our system rigged in some sense? Is the power structure out of touch with the elites? What has caused this anxiety that has led to people like Trump or the rise of someone like Sanders?
Well, surely those are judgment calls, and people make judgments about them all the time. And if you're on the winning side, you think everything is going fine. If you're on the losing side, you think there's a problem. That's the way politics has always operated. And we also have a history in this country in which people who have had power have used that power to make things nice for them and also for their friends. So if people are worried about the fact that whoever the next president is going to make things nice for their friend, they are absolutely right. And it doesn't matter, though, who that president will be. It's just the way that politics works in this country. And you think about it, it's sort of the checks and balances. And I do have some thoughts about whether it's a good thing or not. But there are some checks and balances there, and it's called our elections every 4 years. We're able to have a transition of power in this country for some 250 years without military intervention.
Right, pretty amazing. Really.
Even Abraham Lincoln becoming the president, John Breckinridge presided over that certification in the Senate before then bolting the Union. But I'm not saying it's a good thing, because that's where the abuse of power comes from, and that's where cronyism comes from, and we've got a history of that in this country. To what degree it's going to happen with the next president remains to be seen.
But is it worse now? I mean, is the abuse and cronyism somehow different now that has made, I mean, it seems like this election season is a more heated season than it was 4 years ago or 8 years ago, even as heated as those campaigns were.
We're likely hearing about it more because we're so saturated with media. But if you go back to Warren Harding and some of the problems that he had with his presidency, where people think that that maybe was the most corrupt presidency that existed, Andrew Jackson and the cronyism that existed there, all through history, you're going to have things like that. John Adams, if he had cronyism, he didn't have very many friends. Thomas Jefferson, lots of cronyism going on there. The Bushes, the Clintons, Ronald Reagan, everyone had friends who benefited from their presidency.
Right. Well, Peter, let's bring you on this too. I mean, how do you see the changes that this election has called forth? What has caused the rise of these of an outsider like Donald Trump to become so prominent in our politics?
I see this in part in terms of larger cultural issues. I think we're almost at a cultural tipping point. I think, much of it has been said about Trump drawing upon, the white working class, for example. Although, some of those early surveys of his support when he was in the Republican, primaries, a lot of some of the early surveys indicated that his support was coming from people who had even higher economic means than some of the other Republican candidates. But he does draw from the less educated whites, for example. And so I see this as part of a symptom of a larger kind of cultural crisis. I think a lot of his support right now comes from people who are dissatisfied with the way the culture has been changing over the last 50 years or 60 years, whether it's economically, but also there's other cultural issues, right? So I think of it in terms of maybe a loss of white hegemony, maybe a loss of Christian dominance in the culture, and we've seen a sea tide of different kinds of changes that I think are being manifested in certain types of support for Donald Trump.
So it seems to me that's an interesting dynamic that we can examine a little bit here. I mean, on the one hand, we could say the rise of some of the political outsiders in the current election season has to do with economic anxiety. It has to do with, a changing place in an overall economy. On the other side, we could say it has to do with a changing place in our society. It has to do with changes in demographics. It has to do with social or cultural feelings of alienation. And I'm sure that both are somehow at work, as you're suggesting, but is it that one is really more at work than the other? I mean, you could make an argument that it is not so much the economic stuff. I mean, our economy, while certainly there are problems for certain people in our country, for sure, I mean, overall our economy seems to be doing reasonably well by world standards, maybe by historical standards, about as good as it's ever been. So does that mean that it's more of a cultural, social set of issues that are causing people to seek out someone like Trump?
I think so. I think we need to ask the question, what enabled him to rise to the top in the Republican primaries? He was pushing the birther issue even after Obama had produced his birth certificate. So this is as late as 2011. What catapulted him to the front of the Republican primaries is when he started chanting, "Build a wall," right? He started in my view, he started separating himself from some of the other Republican candidates, and he had that kind of, he had the outsider status, the successful businessman who was going to shake things up in Washington. So I think he's tapping into people who are frustrated with Washington and they want an outsider. But he's also tapping into a certain segment of the population that is very much concerned with losing kind of cultural control, because we've seen all these changes that have been taking place.
Yeah, well, Todd, what do you think about that? I mean, is there a sense in which there are cultural issues that are overriding social or economic issues?
Well, I think the economic issues actually intensify the cultural issues. You've got folks that as they watch the country change, it changes ethnically and it's changing racially.
Right.
And technology is changing, the way we work. And so you've got people that are watching all that, they're anxious about that, and they're also not prospering. So I think voters that I've talked to feel like they're sort of in a corner where they don't like the way the country's changing, they're not prospering. And so I think, if the economics were better for a lot of these folks, maybe they wouldn't be as uncomfortable with the cultural changes, but with the economics the way it is, they're looking for somebody to blame. They're blaming immigrants. They're blaming political correctness to some extent. They're blaming all of these sort of scapegoats because their position, they feel like they're slipping. And I think the economics has something to do with it, along with sort of this idea that we're no longer, white guys like me are no longer running things within the culture. I think all of that it's sort of all intertwined.
Well, then what are we, I mean, if there's some truth to this, what are we supposed to do in order to bridge that gap? I mean, how do we either A, create better economic conditions that lessen the overall anxiety, or B, how do we make it so that people aren't just mad about, there's a black president or a potential woman president, or the Mexicans are taking my job. I mean, how do we redress that at some level, at a political level? I mean, to anyone here, I don't know.
Well, I think that's what we're struggling with. That's why we're frustrated with this presidential election, and that's what I think has caused all of this attention. People are looking to Washington for answers. It's odd because we say we don't want Washington to tell us what to do, yeah. But we want Washington to give us the answers. And we want them to give us the answers that we want. And so therein comes the problem. And we not only don't get answers right now because of some of the gridlock that's been going on in Washington, say, the last 8 years, but we're not even getting discussion about the issues, nor proposals. Every once in a while, during John Boehner's reign as the House Speaker, an idea would come up on how to balance the budget. And it immediately, in his own caucus, it would get shot down. The President Obama, health care, and some of the things that he wanted to do, some of the things he proposed in his 2 years when he had the Democratic Congress were getting shot down by Democrats. And so we look at that and we say, well, if you can't even work together, how on earth are you going to work when you're not on the same side?
Right. But it seems like that creates a kind of vicious circle, because on the one hand, we start to lose faith in Washington because they're not working together. And then we elect people who run against Washington and who go in and who don't work with other people because that's what they've been called to do, is to be radicals who transform everything. And when someone proposes a compromise, it's rejected out of hand, and which just creates more cynicism about the system overall.
And oddly enough, the beauty of what's going on is what this country was founded on, is that if you have all of this argument and disagreement, the only good laws that will get promulgated will be the ones that people can coalesce around and agree with. What I'm really fascinated about are people who keep getting elected to Washington and say they're going there as the outsider and that they're going to shake things up, even though they've been in Congress. I think that's been an interesting thing that I've seen pretty well all of my life.
But is there something that can be, I mean, I get that on the one hand we want a little bit of gridlock to prevent terrible laws from moving forward, but at the same time, it seems like we also want some kind of workability at the governmental level too. How do we, as a country, start to get that from people? What do we have to do?
Well, and we're not really having that discussion because, on the Republican side, Donald Trump, you don't hear Donald Trump say, I'm going to ask Congress to do this, or I'm going to ask Congress to do that. Donald Trump says, I'm going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. I'm going to deport people. I'm going to tear up the trade agreements. He's basically talking about, and he's said it in sort of his acceptance speech of the convention, I'm the only one who can fix this. And so that's sort of put that whole conversation on hold, because if he gets elected, we have a system where the president really can't do all of that on his own. There are executive orders and things we've seen, but so he's actually just decided not to have that conversation.
Right, but that seems to be setting, if he's elected, that would be setting things up for real failure then on his part, because he wouldn't be able to come through on any of these promises, which would make him just like all the other politicians.
Yeah, we got an election where huge disappointment is going to be sort of the product either way we go, because Hillary Clinton's got plans, but we've seen what's happened to Barack Obama's plans. They've sat on a shelf for years while Congress has remained gridlocked. So it's it's promises made and promises that probably can't be kept, unfortunately.
Peter, did you want to get on this about how do we create some system where things work at least a little bit for us in Washington?
Well, I think one of the problems that we have right now at the state level, there's so many states that have gerrymandered their districts, right? So the voting patterns, you're getting increasingly radicalized representatives that are showing up in Congress. And so unless there was some sort of, national body that would kind of carve up the districts, like we have in Iowa. We have a very fair system in Iowa, but boy, you look at some of the maps in some of the other states in which they're kind of guaranteeing a certain representation, and it kind of shoves to the side on more moderate voices of people who are willing to compromise.
Well, that does seem like an important thing, to have a kind of fair districting going on, though that doesn't seem like the sexiest issue for people to be running on, but it does seem like one thing that could perhaps lead to some moderation in our government.
Well, and that's the weakness sort of the democratic system, is that when you need sort of fundamental political reforms like that, you have to ask the people who have been elected and benefited from the current system to do it. And so, you're going to have a hard time telling states that, have Republican or Democratic legislatures that like the way it is to go to the Iowa plan, which, the computer draws the maps and it's more equitable.
Yeah, well, so I'd like to kind of return to Trump right now, since he is the Republican nominee. So to what extent is Trump's political success, does it have to do with just disgruntlement at the Republican establishment and Republican elites? And to what extent is it a product of a long history in Republicanism? Does Trump represent some new thing coming to the Republican Party, or is he the continuation of an old set of, or a long-standing set of trends within the party?
Well, he brings something new to the political process. I don't know if you could call it bringing something new to the Republican Party, because he's been doing a lot of refining and redefining there. And so that there certainly are the elements of the party that says you gotta spend within your means. You just can't do everything. And you have to be precise about how you spend, and let's not get too much government involved. But he is doing a lot of redefinition there, and we've had that type of thing in history before. There was the old Federalist Party. It fell by the wayside, so that you had just a Democratic-Republican Party for a while, and then the Whigs came in and they flamed out, replaced by the Republican Party. So early on in our nation's history, the changing of political parties was not all of that unusual. It's just that we've had these two major parties since 1856.
Right, yeah.
Well, I think Trump is a manifestation of trends in the Republican Party, in the sense that the Republican Party has become increasingly the party of kind of white, a kind of white identity movement, and I think you're seeing it with all the kind of trigger phrases that he uses to kind of stir up white resentment towards multiculturalism or new immigrants or Muslims, right? And when you look at the survey data, Trump supporters, 75% of Trump supporters think that Muslims, Islamic values are incompatible with democratic values. 75% are uncomfortable in situations where immigrants are speaking a language other than English, and so you begin to see a kind of pattern emerging. Whereby, again, we're getting back to that kind of cultural tipping point. The Pew researchers have suggested that, by 2060, whites are going to be in a plurality. They're no longer going to be in a majority. And I see this whole Trump phenomenon in part as a kind of last-ditch effort to kind of control the culture and control the government, and it's sometimes spoken of in very apocalyptic terms. This is our last chance, right? So I think there's that kind of cultural clash.
I would argue, though, that what you're really talking about are the people who are defining themselves as Republicans, grassroots people who are trying to find a voice. Because if you think about the Republican Party and the leadership of that party, After the 2012 election, they came out with a document that said we need to be more compassionate with Hispanics and Muslims. We need to watch out what we're saying. We need to actually open up the arms and listen to what they're saying. So that was the Republican leadership. Well, that was the Republican leadership.
Right.
But people who want to identify themselves as Republicans weren't buying into that as well, and that's what Trump tapped into. That's why I'm saying that Trump is really tapping into something here different than perhaps just what the Republican Party had stood for even 4 years ago.
Right. Well, but I guess here's another dilemma, though, that I think is raised is, on the one hand, it does seem like there are at least some racial issues at stake here. You know, the extent to it we can argue about, but it seems like there's something going on here. But at the same time, it also seems like part of the problem is how much scorn we have for each other, and then all of a sudden, perhaps this just deepens it to say, well, you support Trump, you're a racist. Is that going to heal a divide? You know, how can we, like I said, deal with this situation going forward? If not at the level of who we elect, just at the level of even just how do we relate to each other as a community with people who have political differences from us? Do we just scorn the one as a racist or a fascist, or on the other hand, scorn the other as someone who should be locked up and who's you know, illegitimate?
I mean, both sides have dug really deep trenches. And I mean, if you've spent any time on Facebook or social media, I mean, in my job, I have lots of Facebook friends, and they're on both sides of the political spectrum, and it's the stuff they're throwing back at each other is, I mean, it's amazing. And I mean, we've gone, and I've noticed this in my job, I've gone from getting emails from folks who disagree with me, who seek to persuade me to their point of view, to getting email from folks that just basically want me to disappear from the face of the earth. I mean, they don't want me to write anymore. I am wrong and I need to go away. And that's what we're doing, is we're basically, you know, there's a lot of this rhetoric about taking the country back.
Right.
I mean, it's like we're living in, we have like two separate factions that are in some sort of kind of civil war situation. You know, we got to take the country back. And then I don't, you know, but what's really, I mean, the truth is, you got a divided country, and after the election's over, the only way you can solve issues and problems is if you talk about it with each other. And it's gotten so far removed from that I really honestly don't know how we sort of find our way back. I guess it's going to take some leadership and some people with political courage to sort of step out of those trenches and try to work things out.
Right. I mean, I take it part of the peaceful transition that Lyle was describing comes from a kind of interesting attitude overall that says, well, we're going to have lots of political passion, you know, maybe we'll even say a few things that step over the line, but at the end of the day, someone's going to win the election, someone's going to lose, and we respect that, and we will accept that because, you know, that's what we do, and that creates a harmonious system overall. The fear that some people have is that on both sides, to some degree, there's some sense of, I don't know that I can accept this anymore. I mean, Trump himself has suggested at times that if Hillary wins, it will be a rigged election at some level and illegitimate. And I've certainly known many Clinton supporters who sort of say, I'm leaving if Trump is elected. I'm out of here. You know, and maybe that is just high spirits that will go away after the election. Everyone will say, well, good game. Let's shake on it and go back to business as usual. But I think a lot of people are afraid that there's going to be at least some small segment of the country that isn't going to accept the outcome of the election. Is that too?
Yeah, likely you'll be half of the country. Really, I mean, I've often thought about this, that the next president of the United States, whomever that is, half of the country is opposed to that person. And this time it's really been deep and personal. And you go back to 2000, and there was some personal animosity there with how all of that came together with the Supreme Court finally stepping in and saying, all right, Florida votes are certified and let's move on, and George Bush is president.
Right.
Democrats feeling the election had been stolen from them. And so animosity existed there, but the government still functioned.
Sure.
The concern here is that half of the people want to put the potential president of the United States in prison, and half of the people think that the potential president of the United States is a dangerous buffoon. And so either way, we're in a lose-lose situation, it almost seems, which is tragic because we need a president for 4 years.
So what do we do, Peter, about that?
Well, I'm pretty pessimistic. I think we get increasingly we belong in these kind of to these kind of isolated, cocoons, via social media or via the cable news networks, that we watch, and where people get their news from, and they're kind of reinforcing this kind of resentment of the other. So that this inability to discuss matters in civil tones and to do it without demonizing people who are on the opposite side or have a different point of view, I've become increasingly pessimistic over the course of the last 8 years, in particular, with the kind of language that we're using now in our political discourse.
Right. Well, Todd, I mean, is there anything the next president can do to start to at least heal some of these deep divisions that seem to have been exposed in this election season?
It's going to be difficult. I mean, if Hillary Clinton wins, I think we've already seen, well, it will depend on who controls both houses of Congress, or both chambers of Congress, House and the Senate. But I mean, she's going to be under investigation probably from day one. And we saw with when President Obama was sworn in, there was lots of ceremony and talk of bipartisanship, and then there were closed meetings where people were saying we're going to obstruct everything he wants to do. And I think that's where we're headed now. I don't think Democrats will be in any mood to sort of work with Donald Trump, because if Donald Trump wins, it could be a situation where he wins the Electoral College and not the popular vote. I mean, there are all sorts of really sort of bad scenarios, but I really think it's going to have to come down to some members of Congress that I think, the president is going to be over here, and then Congress is going to have to get some things done, and some people are going to have to just step up and try to work some things out, and maybe put their political careers on the line for the good of the country. And I think maybe if it gets bad enough, there will be enough people that decide they need to do that. But I'm not optimistic. Probably the only optimistic thing I think, I will be surprised if there's actual violence after the election. I think the gap between sort of saying you're going to do something and actually doing it is really, really wide. And so I'm hopeful that doesn't happen. But geez, I mean, the idea that there's going to be legislation or some sort of compromise in the first 100 days. I mean, they always say the honeymoon's short. There'll be no honeymoon. There will be. There's no marriage. I mean, it's not going to be.
Well, what about? I mean, we only have about a minute left. But Lyle or Peter, I mean, what about just personally? I mean, what can we do to start to bridge some of these deep divisions going forward?
Seek the truth, speak the truth, and be kind to each other. Pretty lame, but there you have it. Okay, well,
I think we have to kind of end on that note. I think that's a little bit of optimism for us. I certainly do hope that as citizens we can learn to have some kind of conversations, even if they're heated disagreements, and still respect each other moving forward. And so I hope that we've modeled that a little bit on this show, but I hope that the conversation that we have started here is one that you continue in your homes and communities. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time on Ethical Perspectives on the News.